You saw Tony Wood quoted in that story, the Director of Energy and Climate Change Program at the Grattan Institute. He joins me now. Thanks very much for your time. There's always so many different ways to read all of these figures. It seems to me that prices have come down, but from a very high level, and they're still high, and what forecast to go higher again this year. How would you sum up the state of energy prices in Australia?
I think they reflect, in some ways, Tom, the enormous change that's going on in our energy system. Was sort of talked about in that introduction, that we're fundamentally taking a system that's 100 years old and turning it on its head in less than 30 years. And that's never going to be a simple process. And so from time to time, we will see, as we saw in the middle of last year, some really difficult parts of that transition. Now, unfortunately, the unfortunate timing of that, of course, is that the costs of meeting the problems of last year are only now flowing through to residential prices. And so at the same time, as we are seeing wholesale prices coming down a bit, the retail prices, the bit that you and I pay, have just gone up from the 1st of July. So it's hard to sort of match those two. But I think if things stay where they are now, and that's a big if, then you would expect to see some relief, but not for probably the rest until almost this time next year.
Yeah, well, that's the if. The other interesting part of this, you alluded to renewables. We're seeing more wind and solar in the scheme, and even at times, more frequently, negative wholesale prices. So because, you know, the sun's shining and the wind's blowing during the middle parts of the day, we're seeing that get to the negative, and yet overall prices remain high. So does this speak to the sort of the difficulty and the fact that even with the very cheap nature of renewable energy production, getting that in the grid is still not a cheap exercise in the short and medium term, even though it should get cheaper longer term, depending on the storage solutions?
Look, I think you've pretty well captured it, Tom, and that is that wind and solar are the cheapest form of electricity. But of course, they are, by their very nature, intermittent. And that means when they're not there, when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining, then other things have to fill the gap, whether it's stored renewables, whether it's gas, or whether it's even in the long-term hydrogen. Now, what I think happens here is the cost of the transmission to connect the renewables and the cost of the storage to back up those renewables tends to offset the lower cost of the electricity coming from the renewables. And so I think, I think we'll see some improvement as things continue to stabilise, and assuming we don't have any more nasty outages. But as that transition continues, I think broadly speaking, we'll see prices probably maybe a little lower, but not much compared with where they are now. But what we are doing is we're making this transition and getting the emissions reduction effectively at virtually no cost. And that's a very significant move. And that's one of the reasons why we are seeing this very significant continual movement in emissions reduction from the electricity sector, as you said. It'll be good when the rest of the economy catches up.
Yeah, so that's the bright light in all of this. The other thing noted by EMO, and I thought this was pretty straight language by EMO on what's happening on gas. You've alluded to this before on the program. Victoria is running out of reserves it uses for domestic gas, and we're going to hit a point where it runs out of gas unless either it goes into some more exploration, which we don't think is going to happen, or what's the alternative? Beetaloo, something else, Narrabeen, whatever it might be. But without that, the last big hoo-ha over gas, it's going to be an even bigger one.
Yeah, I think, you're absolutely right. I've been talking about this now for several years. No one's been paying much attention. The story has continued. The traditional sources of gas, over 50 years ago when it first started to flow from Bass Strait into Victoria, and Victoria, for most of that time, has been an exporter. They're not renewable. That's the nature of them. They are a limited supply, and they are now starting to run down. Unfortunately, the alternatives have not been put in place. So whether it's an import terminal, whether it's more gas to come from the north, and there's not that many places to get it from, or whether it's more onshore development, and in Victoria, that's pretty well zero, very difficult. And even to think about, well, can we get all the consumers to stop using gas? Well, there's over 2 million people in Victoria use gas today for heating their homes and cooking their food. And even though we think it's the right way to go, it's not going to happen quickly. So in the next couple of years, it could be uncomfortable if we had a situation when cold weather means high demand for gas, but at the same time, if you had, say, for example, a coal-fired power station offline, and then we needed the gas for power generation as well, then that could get quite tricky in the short term. Now, there's no simple solutions, and I don't want to suggest, by the way, we should panic about it, but it's just going to get worse over the next 4 or 5 years, and we are going to have to find a solution to this, because even though we might want to get off
Yeah.
gas because it's no longer cheap, it's no longer plentiful, and it is a fossil fuel. In the short term, it's a very painful thing to do. So getting that balance right is very important. And right now, I have to say, I don't think we have.
Yeah, it still looks problematic, this transition. And well, the other fascinating part, we actually had more coal in the system available compared to when Liddell was in the system through a bit of an anomaly. And that's the way the coal goes on and offline. Anyway, we could talk about it all day. I'm sure you could, Tony. We'll talk about it again down the track. Thank you.